Hello there. We're going to be pressing on ahead with the psychological and spiritual functioning relationship. We're continuing on in the Thomas and Sosin book. It's important to think about underneath our knowledge of our faith experience, there's psychological and neuropsychological processes that influence how we relate and experience God. And the same is true with those who we connect with in the counseling context or even in the coaching context. People have preconceived ideas about what it means to be in relationship with the Lord. Some of that comes from childhood and our earliest experiences, as well as those relationships that we experience with parents, grandparents growing up. Each person internalizes representations of the self, others, and God around the themes of felt security and love. So this really begins at the attachment stages of our earliest memories and all the way up through adolescence and into adulthood. These memories are stored in the limbic system, so it means they have a very high emotional content. That's where our safety needs come from, or our sense of feeling out of control, or even traumas are stored in the limbic system. So we often feel them before we mentally process them, where that's more in the prefrontal cortex. But those earliest memories are limbic. The internal working models develop into a general attachment style, and they reflect the early attachment experiences that people have with their caregivers. Much of what we experience or know viscerally, deep down, or even in the body are based on those internalizations that were conceived during our pre-verbal phases of development. So again, when we're very, very young, those things are contained in the limbic system, and they seem to be our hardware. Certainly our way of thinking and how we get through those can be more equated with software, that we learn to think new thoughts, but our natural state is what we learn early on. People who develop a secure attachment style have more adaptive schemas, or those deep beliefs, and the neurobiological networks that reflect trust in self, others, and God. Insecure attached people develop maladaptive schemas and neurobiological networks that reflect mistrust in the self, others, and even mistrust of God. Perhaps there's been a questioning process or a traumatic period where people have questioned, where is God in all of this, or where were my parents when these things were happening? And it develops a deep insecurity. The schemas are relatively stable throughout life, so that's both good and bad. It's good in that consistency is one of those things we can rely on. It can be negative if the schemas are negative and they don't help us develop a stronger relationship with others, or certainly with the Lord. What people experience from their relationship with self, others, and God are from templates, a template of unconscious internal working models. So these are things that sometimes are going to be beyond the scope of what we do in ministry counseling, and may take more intensive counseling for a little longer period. However, as people begin to think about their thinking, we call that metacognition, they can start to identify their preconceived ideas that they often jump to as their working schema. People with insecure attachment tend to perceive God as controlling, less accepting, nurturing, and distant as well. Bob Lehman had done some work years ago on looking at attachment style and the metaphor of God as father and human father, and making that connection together, and found that if one's earthly father is distant, it's very easy to see God as distant. If one's earthly father was nurturing, people often perceive God as nurturing. If God was a provider and provided financially, people see God as a God of abundance and also providing for our needs. So there's a strong connection there in thinking through God the Father and God in our earthly father when we're young. Assessing spirituality is not easy because one's experience with God is a complex matter. Grimes differentiates between the God image and the God construct. God image, according to Grimes, is a psychological construct concerned with how one feels toward God and how God feels about them. It's primarily unconscious, so maybe someone feels judged or they feel confident and competent. These things we're not largely aware of, but it impacts our sense of who we are in the Lord. The God construct refers to a person's cognitive understanding of God. So these are well thought out, or at least we're more aware of it. And it would be a way to think about our our theological perspective. So those things we could verbalize and say, this is what I believe about God, or this is who I am, my status in the Lord. Some of the practical issues in assessing someone's spiritual beliefs. Tell me about your religious beliefs and feelings is an open-ended question that can be useful to glean some information. Determine specific experiences of God, prayer. You can also use different instruments themselves. There's the Attachment to God inventory developed by Beck and McDonald, and there's also the Remuda Spiritual Assessment Questionnaire, and you can find more information online as well as in the chapter. A spiritual life map is a chronological, illustrated account of a person's relationship with God from birth. So you can use those kinds of tools and have someone draw it out if they're more of a visual learner. People who generally like to journal can also draft a letter to God. This is a technique or an assessment tool where a person can share their true thoughts, feelings, questions, concerns, requests in relation to God. There's really no right or wrong response, and it's more for you in working with someone to glean some assessment information on their relationship with the Lord and some of the preconceived schemas that they bring into the counseling or coaching session. There's also an Attachment with God experiential survey, which taps into a person's internal experience of God. Incarnational counseling assumes that the counselor implicitly, without words, brings Jesus into the counseling via God's Spirit working in and through him or her in each session. So it's not that we're not necessarily using scripture or prayer or other spiritual disciplines in our counseling, but incarnational counseling is being Christ to those that we're serving in the counseling or coaching context. As well, we're exploring beliefs and experiences, and we're integrating a spiritual perspective in all that we're doing. Some counselees as well have harmful religious or spiritual beliefs that are incongruent with the tenets of their faith, but they present those things at the experiential level. We might see this with addictions or abusive patterns or life habits, say like engaging in an affair that would be at odds with one's spiritual belief. And these are things that you can begin to unpack, and a lot of times will bring someone into your counseling session. Exploring beliefs increases awareness and accountability. So once it's out there, you can begin to highlight some of the dissonance where maybe one's thoughts and beliefs and feelings are at odds with one's actual behaviors and attitudes. The spiritual disciplines are interventions that promote mental, physical, social, and spiritual health. And there's some great books on spiritual disciplines, including by Foster and others. Prayer, meditation, spiritual reading, reading good Christian books, as well as scripture, of course, memorizing scripture, confession, if it's a sin issue or something that someone needs to confess, and then also seeking forgiveness. Prayer, healing prayer is a good way that people can embrace a more spiritual or disciplined life. Multimodal prayer intervention involves meditation, relaxation, training, and imagery as well. We also must be ethical in the incorporation of prayer. In the written materials in the course, there's also some information on Mark McMinn, who's a psychologist out of Wheaton, and has written on the ethical use of prayer. Someone who may have grown up in a home where prayer was used in an abusive or disciplinary way, as in to punish someone or make them feel guilty. Using prayer in the counseling context without knowing that ahead of time could be a trigger for a person in the counseling session. So it's just important to know where someone's coming from before we necessarily jump into prayer. At least have that sense that for some people prayer could be a welcome part of the counseling session, but for some it could be a turnoff, or it could be something that creates a barrier between you and the counselee. Meditation is a means to focus one's mind on God, and oftentimes I've used meditation with clients in the form of meditating on Scripture, so meditating on a psalm or meditating on God's presence and finding a Scripture passage that conveys truth, and then meditating on that and visualizing what that would look like in their life. It's also combining systematic relaxation and deep breathing while focusing the mind on whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, and admirable. So again, focusing on scriptural principles is useful in helping someone to get back and ground themselves on biblical principles. And also practicing the presence of God. We know that God is omnipresent everywhere, and to think through how the Lord is always there. Practicing the presence of God can be useful for our clients. So reading Scripture, all those things should be relevant to the client's needs. And we know that Scripture can be used for comforting, clarifying, correcting, changing, cleansing, convicting, curing, or healing. And as well, we can use bibliotherapy and assigning scriptures for reading, also listening to audio scripture. I found that useful in the car. I've worked with people who travel a lot with their work, but being able to have audio versions of scripture, whether on a digital file or a CD or cassette, if they have a cassette player. Those are all useful ways to integrate scripture into their daily routine and habits. Confession is useful, again, if there's a sin issue that needs to be brought out into the open and forgiveness is sought, then that's an important piece of bringing that in for spiritual discipline. Some people may not have an idea of forgiveness. Again, going back to early childhood and life schemas, sometimes people who have not experienced much forgiveness, but rather judgment and condemnation, sometimes it's a tough sell to realize that Jesus has forgiven one's sins and one's debt. Practically, it means to give up or give away anger and the actions associated with it. So along with that, some people have a hard time thinking about being forgiven. At the same time, if there's anger or hurt, realizing that they as well have to give that up. Collaboration with a spiritual community is important, and this is really where we're going to end the lecture at this point. Hopefully in our congregations, our faith communities, we have healthy communities, and if not, that's something that certainly as leaders we need to address in our own midst. But we can and sometimes should consult with the counselees, religious or spiritual leaders, if that's not us. If you're the pastor or working in a ministry context, we're a part of that process. But when not, we should certainly get them involved in helping to encourage healthy growth and development. Also note as well the diagrams in the decision tree in chapter 14. That will be useful as you think through some steps that you can take in assessing spirituality, as well as next steps.